So, all right. Well, we are going to get started because it is 10:04 and I feel like it's Q4. Everyone's got a lot to do, so we should probably jump in.
That sounds like a plan.
So really quickly, just some housekeeping things. I know everyone asked this question and I'm sure we'll get it asked again, but we will share the recording and the slides. So we will definitely be sending those out in the next few days. And also we even have a special bonus mutual action Excel spreadsheet that you'll see in the deck that Geoff is going to send to you all. So really excited about that. Make sure you use chat to connect with other attendees. This is obviously great for you to connect with Challenger, but also make sure you connect with other attendees. For questions at the end, we are going to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So for questions at the end, just make sure you use the Q&A tab because that's what we're going to check. And then really, really important, please complete the post-webinar survey. It will take 2 minutes. It gives us just really good feedback on what you want to hear, what content we should do. It gives Geoff and I a lot of great feedback. And so we want to make these as informative as possible for all of you. So any input, feedback, whatever you want to tell us, even if you hated our song, all of that, Geoff should have danced more. We need, anything we need to know. So before we move on, just want to make sure we have those groundkeeping rules. And really quickly, I'm Andee Harris. I'm the CEO of Challenger. Also a few little things. I do love talking all things sales culture. Traveling, as Geoff mentioned, I try to be a world-class traveler here, cooking, the outdoors. So just a little bit for those of you that don't know me, and I'm so excited to get to be hosting this with Geoff because not only is he an awesome thought partner, but he's just fantastic at pretty much everything he does. But I'll let Geoff introduce himself as well.
Yeah, I'm really excited to join you, Andee. I just hit 4 years at Challenger. I joined on Halloween, so that's a memorable join date, And what's funny about me is this is actually the first time I've held a bag. So I came from the world of consulting. And so I literally made every mistake and had every misunderstanding of sales under the sun. But I'm still here 4 years later using this as a place to learn and grow. So I'm excited to share, some of the things that I've learned from our Challenger experts over the past 4 years.
I feel like, Geoff, we should have said what Challenger profile we're recovering from. So I'm a recovering relationship builder and you're like a recovering solution seller.
That's right. I was like the classic problem solver. So I definitely fall into that bucket for sure.
So so for those of you who have not read the Challenger book, it's divided in different profiles. It's really fascinating to see kind of where you lean in and how obviously the idea of Challenger is that we help you use those as a great foundation, but also use the Challenger skills to help, especially in Q4 and during uncertain times, close deals. But we're moving on because we got a lot to cover today. So before we do that, we always want to hear from you all. What are you doing now to work towards a strong close in 2023? So it's either what are you doing or what is your leadership team doing? I see communication with your customers, urgency.
Yeah. And
I love the focusing on the pipeline.
Yeah. I mean, it really does come down to thinking about, and critically thinking, where do I need to put my time, right? It's like what I'm loving about this is that folks are definitely zeroing in on the deals that need to their attention. They need their time and trying to distinguish between, what really has an opportunity to close and where folks are maybe just spinning their wheels a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that gets back to even the first one a little bit around reducing clutter, because part of that reducing clutter is not spending time with customers that are probably, as we call them in the Challenger world, talkers, but not really mobilizers.
Absolutely. I mean, speaking of mobilizer, it looks like number 2 is stakeholder review to make sure we've engaged the right folks.
Yeah.
And what are the signs that those folks are telling us? I mean, number 1 and number 2, I think are directly related.
Yeah, and I'm curious. So I'm feeling really good that we are giving a Q4 spiff to our Challenger employees, but sales reps. But I will say, I wonder if that's something to do with the economy right now too. Is just people are being cautious. But yeah. So this looks kind of what I expected. Geoff, any big surprises for you?
No, I think the one thing that's always interesting is amping up customer communication frequency. you know, is it more communication or is it better communication?
Yeah. Please don't send the email, just checking in. Just wanted to just wanted to see if you're alive.
100%. I think that's some of the things we're going to talk about today is, what are some of the ways that we can effectively communicate with our folks?
Yes, I think we just shared the results to all of you. So hopefully you guys can see them. If not, we'll definitely be sharing them. But yeah, the number one was definitely prioritizing your pipeline to focus on the deals that are most likely to close. So thank you all for your participation.
Well, given it's Q4 and that I was mentioning, minus 40 degrees, which we're probably not there yet in most places, I want to talk about something that's on everybody's mind, which are Olympic sports. And so what we're going to do is put up some numbers, and what I would love to see in the chat, if folks are open to it and paying attention, are some guesses as to which Olympic sport this is. And so this is the length of the Olympic course, if you will. And so I'm going to pull open the chat and see if we can't get somebody. And it takes the folks 1 minute and 40 seconds to go down this almost 3 kilometer long course. And if you are putting things in the chat, remember to send it to everyone. All right. So we got our first guess.
I'm looking. Oh, I see
Bobby says bobsled. Carter says hurdles. A 3 kilometer hurdle course. That would be literally the craziest thing I've ever heard of. The high jump, I love it. Swimming, luge, alpine skiing. All right, well, I'll give you guys one more number. They go 106 kilometers per hour. And so for reference here, that's about 65 miles an hour. And that's just like the average speed. So, all right, I like it. Michael's getting more specific. Giant slalom.
Oh, parachuting. That's an interesting one, Adam. I like that.
Interesting. Race walking. That would be some very fast walking.
That's a really fast horse. Look at that.
That's a very fast horse. And Chris says cold calling. All right, we're gonna let you guys.
Oh, I like cold calling. That's funny.
So this is downhill skiing, and it is the downhill race. So John Bailey, absolutely, you nailed it. Nice job. And what's fun about this is, does anybody know who won the 2018 men's downhill from Pyeongchang, South Korea? Yeah, I didn't either. So it's actually a gentleman named Axel Lund Svindal. And so Axel, as you see, biting his Olympic gold medal in this next beautiful shot that we have there, won this race. And what's interesting is he didn't win it by a lot. So I wonder if anybody knows who got second place. And I'm not going to keep you all waiting because frankly, I didn't either. But luckily we have Google.
Oh, we have one. Tom says Jansrud.
Jansrud.
I just ruined that completely.
All right. So either Tom is incredibly fast with Google or he is a downhill skiing expert, because he is absolutely right. And so
Tom.
Well, you look at that, so if you look at, what was the difference in terms of time that separated them, on the next couple slides, what we see is that Axel, who is from Norway, and Kjetil, which is Jean-Rud's last name, also from Norway, were separated by 0.12 seconds. Now, if you're familiar with downhill skiing, that's actually pretty common. It's crazy how these guys are going down this course and they're that close. In fact, the third place finisher, Beat Freutz, was only 0.06 seconds further back from that. So what I thought, when I was thinking about this, it's like, how much or how far apart is that really? If you come to think about it. And so if you think about the course, it had a vertical drop of about 825 meters down. And this is Olympic sports, so we're going to do all sort of metrics. And over those 3 kilometers, it would actually, they would drop almost 1,000 kilometers in height. And so if we take a look, we've actually kind of drawn this out for you guys in terms of where the course was. So if it took the racers about 1:40 to complete this 3-mile course, like how much was actually separating these guys? And what's interesting is that at 106 kilometers per hour, they were actually going 8.3 meters per second. So every second they're flying down the course at 8 meters. And, what was interesting is if we start to look at the separation between Beat and Axel, it was 1.48 meters. So 1.5 meters. And what's amazing is, you think about how far back Shetto was, an agonizing 0.98 meters, less than a meter behind after preparing 4 years for a race. I mean, you're talking about 1 meter just in between. You think about gold medal bonuses. These are very real things. Endorsement deals, fame, fortune, all separated by a single meter. And you can see them on there on the podium. And the other thing that I love that's really funny is that they actually have surveyed Olympians and found that the third place finisher is much happier than the second place finisher. And that really comes down to the fact that they're just happy they made the podium. And the second place finisher is thinking about, oh man, what if I got there? But either way, I love sports analogies, and sorry if it's a bit cliche, but it's because professional selling really does mirror sports in a lot of ways, in my opinion. And what's interesting is, when we go up against our tougher competitors, like what are the margins that we're either winning or losing by? How different are we in terms of like company, brand, product, service, et cetera? Can our customers perceive it? Is our biggest competitor even another company? Oh, wow. Danny, I love that quote. Nothing is more expensive than coming in second. Oh boy. And so I think today, Andee, and I'd love to get your perspective, is like really, how do we make sure as we get to the final mile, after 4 years of training, maybe not.
Or the final meter.
How do we not come up a proverbial meter short, right? And so that's what kind of the message we have today.
No, I love that. And I think it's so true, right? I mean, I think part of that is preparation. And it's not that these Olympians did not prepare, because we know, to your point, 4 years of training and then, they're pretty much their whole lives, right? So it's certainly not just preparation. I think it's mindset, right? We know that sports is mental as well as just physical. And so I do think that, there's some mix of all of that, right? That goes into this. So as we continue to move ahead, one thing we know that doesn't work is magic. So, a lot of people say, well, can I just have this kind of magical thing where I just sort of wave my wand and the DocuSign magically gets signed and everything kind of works out. And what we know now is these processes are much longer, and it isn't as just, as easy as, waving your magic wand. You really need to think about things like budget approvals, finance sign-off, procurement, legal reviews. And these are all the things that you have to think about after your business. Often, your business champion has said, hey, great, like I verbally really want to do this. And then they're like, but now there's the whole other sales process. I'll go back to my running analogy, because I mean, I do know how to ski, but not like that. So, when you think about a marathon, a lot of people say there's the first 20 miles and then there's the last 6.2 miles. And I think often we get so jazzed and so excited we go out really strong those first 20 miles. And then, the last 6.2 is this whole budget approval, finance, all the things that, like, truly as salespeople, we kind of hate, right? Because it's tedious and it's detail oriented, and we don't actually want to do these things, right? We don't want to live in spreadsheets. That that's not our jam. So I do think that that's also a big piece of this.
Oh, I love that marathon analogy, because it's so true. Because imagine you're 6 miles out, you don't feel like the finish line is right in front of you. It's easy to sprint the last mile, but
right.
Man. That's a great analogy.
We're just going to keep going with the sports ones. So yes, pace yourself. Yeah. So this is awesome, because I love that Geoff brought this to me. And so I'm going to let Geoff jump in on this, but we often talk about a mutual close plan. Like, I wish I could see all your faces and raise of hands, but quick chat, like how many, or yes, you can raise your hand on Zoom. So quick raise of hands. How many of you are like mutual close plan? Well, you know what people don't realize about a mutual close plan? It means nothing to your prospect. They are not often a seller, right? So unless you're in Challenger, where we actually do sell to salespeople, but most often you are selling to someone who the close means nothing to them. Whether you hit a Q1, whether you get the spiff, whether you're hitting your quota, that actually doesn't mean much to them. But what does mean a lot to them is when do I get to kick off the project? When do I start making meaningful changes or meaningful, get to do some things that I actually want to do with this project? So really, reframing that from a close plan to a kickoff plan, I think is so critical. And I'll let Geoff jump into this because this is his baby.
I mean, I think you nailed it, Andee. All I could say is like a light bulb came on to me when and we're going to walk through some of the steps here. Just when I started to think about, when does this really become real for my client? When does this actually feel like it's something real for them? And in our case, and I think a lot of cases, there's some moment of kickoff. And it was like, that's what we're driving towards. That's what we're working towards that they care about. And so if we can center around what matters to them, then all of a sudden they're going to be much more interested. And that's why I think, one of the things that I appreciate about really good sellers is they're often really customer centric. They're thinking about putting themselves in the shoes of the customer and thinking about it from their perspective. And so I think that's all we're doing is making sure that we have their best interests in mind, as well as obviously what's important to us, which is closing the deal. So this is something that I kind of wanted to talk about where, I had so many misconceptions. I mentioned this is the first time I've held a bag. And so, honestly, like even when I was, at Deloitte or at Accenture and I was with, partners and things like that, I thought that the thing about selling was there was just some magical personal network, or they just had a membership at a golf course and took people out, and then they took them to dinner, and they just had this like gift of gab, silver tongue, like they just enchanted people. Like I have to admit, I'm almost frankly embarrassed about it now, but I sort of had this belief that when it came time for closing, that everybody would get in the conference room and like the decision maker would walk in with their team and the seller would get up there. And like, I'm imagining Don Draper and Mad Men, like giving this elegant speech. Maybe they start slow, but it picks up speed. And then just the mic drop moment happens. And all of a sudden the decision maker goes, yes. That.
And everyone starts clapping.
everybody starts clapping, the back slaps, the hugs. Where do I sign? Send the contract over this afternoon, or better yet, let me pull out my pen right now. And boy, was I in for a rude awakening. Sales, if we think about it, it's like, and what the slide says, if it was easy, everybody would do it. And frankly, that's because when we get the prospect to say yes, that's almost just the start of the fun part, because what we're going to see is there are actually a number of moments and spots where it's easy to get tripped up, and it's not such a linear process to go from left where they say yes to right where they actually sign the contract. There are plenty of off ramps that we can run into. I mean, Andee, I'm sure you've had lots of experience seeing all of these in your years and years of both selling and leading companies, of things getting tripped up at the last mile.
Yeah. And I think that's like the biggest thing, right? We've kind of, I won't use any more sports analogies, but like we kind of have this broken arrow, right? Like this idea of like, we think we're there, and then legal's like, wait a minute, did you send me your T's and C's around, your solution? Did you, the CFO is not available, or, procurement's on vacation for 2 weeks, or, so all of these things, right, keep happening, and then I think that's just really hard. I think one of the biggest things that we've learned over the past couple of years is, and I know we're going to get to it in a second, is just really understanding that buying process. And what I think we realized is that even our own internal champions and mobilizers, they don't understand the buying process. So I think it's, sometimes we're like, oh, well, they can just quickly, throw this over the fence. So one of the questions I always like to ask is, have you bought something like this before? Is this something that you're used to doing? Because I think that we often assume that they understand their organizations. And I know we've had situations at Challenger where we're introducing people for the first time through our sales process. We're like, oh, well, hello, business leader over here and business unit person over here and sales enablement person over here. You guys all need to get together and meet each other. So often, a lot of this is like just bringing everybody together. And in this world of, remote and Zoom, that gets even harder because you're constantly trying to connect all the dots within the organization. So the people I've seen that have done this really well are literally almost creating their own org chart and trying to sort of map out. I almost think of it as like the FBI watch list with like all the when you're trying to solve a crime. I love Murders in the Building. So now I'm going to go back from sports to Netflix, Hulu, I guess. Murders in the Building, where she has like all the suspects and how they're all connected with like the string. And I think that's kind of what you need to be able to do from a sales perspective.
I love that. And it's wild. I mean, in large organizations that then in the end that a third party can be the one making introductions, but that's a reality. And to your point, Andee, like I think one of the red flags that jumps up for me is when somebody says like, oh, definitely, or that's easy when it comes to procurement, because frankly, like we see this process from the vision, yes, to like absolutely, either the deal pushing or dying because of all of these things, or actually signing to be like 4 to 8 weeks. That's a common timeline when it comes to procurement. And if we look at it, there are fewer than 8 weeks left in the year. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to avoid this. But if you're okay with it, Andee, I think I'll share a bit of a story that I think is a little bit embarrassing. But, last year I had a deal where I got a verbal yes in June. And so I worked on this deal from December of 2021 till June of 2022. The real intense part was like April to June. They said, yep, it was a very really competitive deal. I was incredibly excited, great logo. And then we said, okay, great, we're going to line up all the right stakeholders. We had like the right-hand person to the president of the business unit. We had our case for change. We calculated ROI. We had stories around like why status quo wasn't okay. We were doing the paperwork. We were doing all the different things. They went to get budget in September out of cycle. And these were like, honestly, couch cushion pennies for this size of organization. And if anybody remembers last year, it was actually, no, we're going to go through the formal budgeting process because we're, looking at every dime. Long story long, we went through that process and it was like watching a slow moving train wreck that you just couldn't get off the tracks. And so, in fact, our SVP called this the most perfectly executed loss he'd ever seen. Unfortunately, those don't come with a commission.
And those don't make you feel any better, by the way. There's no commission for those.
Like moral victories don't count. And I think the point is that we're trying to get at is like, look, we can be at the top of our game and still lose. Like we can be doing all the right things. What we don't want to do is make sure, that one of these items slips out of our view and our grasp, because we're professional sellers and we need to make sure that we're showing up and making sure that, we don't lose it. Because, as we're going to see on the next slide, is the time it takes to win and the time it takes to lose are oftentimes very similar, especially when you're not doing the concept that we would talk about of the nail and the wedge. A lot of folks think about their pipeline as kind of a wedge. And the issue with that is that you're putting a lot of effort into opportunities that aren't going to win. And somebody in the chat, and I'm sorry, there's been so many comments that I've forgotten exactly who said second place is incredibly expensive, and they're right, because it takes nearly the same amount of time versus, what we like to see when we really have challenger sales is a nail. So they're actually narrowing their funnel quite a bit. To your point, Andee, they're starting to find mobilizers and they're starting to find different folks along the way that tell them that they have a high likelihood of closing the deal.
Yeah. And I think that this is just, to me, like such a big piece of it, right? Like, especially as a CEO, right? That's so hard when I see someone working so hard on a deal. And, to your point, it's almost the same amount of days to lose a deal as it is to win a deal. So, you really got to be like super cautious about like where you're spending your time and really thinking about, going back to our poll, right? That prioritization of those accounts that actually look and sound like, are they engaging with you? Are they showing buying signs? Are they, if you're constantly just sending them emails being like, hey, just want to check in, what's going on? Like, if they're ghosting you, but not really ghosting you, like, you got to really measure those things and really think about those things clearly. And I think that's where great coaching and leadership also helps out, because they're really pressure testing those as well.
Absolutely. One of the most common pain points we hear from other leaders right now is forecast accuracy. And, it's a really challenging moment right now to know which deals, pressure test which deals in our pipeline are truly going to close. And I love thinking about it from like, what are the verifiers my buyer have given me? Because if you look at, what you see on the graph here, I have a lot of empathy for our buyers. Like, they have full daytime jobs and they're trying to do all of these things. They're identifying the problem, they're exploring a solution, they're building requirements, and we're just thinking about it like, great, we did discovery, we did this, we're mid-stage, we're closing, and they're doing all of this stuff on their free time. And frankly, it kind of, and I wouldn't say free time, but in their extra time, because they're still responsible for doing their jobs. And what can we as sellers do to start to make this either more simple or take some of the things off of our buyer's plate? Because, as you can imagine, going through all that spaghetti slide, it's easy for a buyer to just tap out and say like, hey, you know what, this is frankly just too hard. And I think that's why we see so many opportunities end up sticking with status quo, ending up in what we call like the no decision or the indecision bucket. So I think today, we're going to talk through some of the items, and Andee, I'll let you take it away for what we can do to actually make this a little bit easier on our buyers.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, of course, we're like, oh, just throw a mutual action plan together, or a mutual kickoff plan. That seems easy, right? But we know that there's a lot of complexity to that. And we know that, especially if you're managing a lot of accounts, to create a kickoff plan for every single account can be really hard and daunting. But we will tell you it definitely pays off. But before we jump into that, because we just showed you a slide, like that scary slide of like, this is what's happening internally in the organizations where people are trying to buy. So I'd love to hear from everyone else. What are the biggest obstacles you're seeing as far as closing this year?
Now, I'm really curious to see this, because like I feel like I've seen every one of these come up in the past 3 months, let alone the past 6 months. And what's interesting is, I think one of the advantages that we have is we get to see a lot of different industries and a lot of different verticals. And I think a lot of folks do as well. And it may be, that much as some of our verticals are this, some of our verticals are that. And Andee, you get to go out and speak to all kinds of different leaders and present. And I'm guessing you've probably heard stories around each one of these as well.
Yeah. Actually, we did some CRO dinners in October, and our theme was, because of Halloween, was kind of tying it into ghosting, right? Because we were like, we've all been there, we've all been ghosted, right? So I'm curious to see, it's like around 37%. Budget freezes for sure. Hearing a lot about that. Change in leadership. I think that's the other thing too, especially if you're selling into more of the tech vertical. We've seen a lot of change in leadership. I think that's something that's, been hard, right? You often hear, especially early stage or startup tech companies, the CRO, she misses her number, for a quarter or two. They're always out the door, right? They're always the first one out the door. And so I do think that we've seen a lot in the change in leadership, especially in the tech sector, and I would say in the SMB mid-market sector. So I guess change in leadership, main contact left the org, kind of same, if you tie those, kind of add those together, right? That's at like 38%. So the good news is, I think that, I guess from a positive perspective, if I look at legal review and procurement review, those aren't as bad as I thought they would be. So maybe people are getting better about like understanding those processes. One of the things I know we've done at Challenger is really try to bring our CFO and our legal team into the process early, so that they are already building that rapport and that relationship. And so we're just getting those conversations going earlier, so it's not at the last minute, when I just joked that procurement goes on vacation for 2 weeks, December 15th, right? So I do think that, that's probably a really good indication. I don't know, Geoff, what else are you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are oftentimes related. Budget freezes and customer ghosted could frankly be that folks are embarrassed that they didn't know some of the most, recent news in their organization, that budgets they thought were available are actually not available. And so I think what's important is, making sure that we're multi-threaded, not just for the sake of having additional contacts, but starting to bring other people into the buying process, who on the client side will be able to fill in the picture. I think some of the other folks talked about, in the chat, like different prioritization changes and initiatives. It's important to be on top of those. And so I think what's great is today we're going to talk a little bit about, what are some of the common obstacles that we see, and how can we start to address those. And right off the top, and I think we've been hinting at this and talking about it, is a lot of times our customers don't actually know their own buying process. They don't know who needs to be involved. They're not sure about the sign-off process. They don't know exactly how, who their procurement contact is or who their legal review contact is, what sort of timelines they have. I'll tell you, legal, if they're reviewing both their potential customer contracts, the one they're going to sign and get revenue from versus the one they're going to go and sign and spend money on, they're going to prioritize the first one when you want them to prioritize the second one. And so a lot of times, a lot of folks aren't able to figure out kind of all of these pieces on their own. And this is where I think talking about being a professional seller is really important. And this is, I think, one of the skills that folks often misinterpret when it comes to Challenger, which is taking control. Folks think, what I hear is like, well, I don't want to be bossing my customer around. And I would agree with you. I wouldn't want to boss my customer around either. Like I try it with my kids and it doesn't work. So how's it going to work with somebody else, And I'm trying to get better at that, by the way. Learning curve. And so really it's more about how can I peer around the corner and start to help my buyer identify these potential mistakes and pitfalls they may not even realize that they're making.
Yeah. And I would just say, Geoff, too, about taking the control piece of that is that, they often want your help, and anyone that can really help them, they're excited, right? The idea in theory is like, they're really excited about your product or your service. And so anything you can do to help them do their job better or help them with the process, and especially depending on what part of the organization, you're selling into, some of them are not used to, building influence or having to have these tough conversations, or frankly, going against their CFO for budget. These are all new muscles for a lot of them. So having a trusted advisor, and once again, we talked about that earlier in the process of Challenger, but like earning the right to be able to be that trusted advisor, then, when you get into some of these obstacles, you really have already earned that trust, and that they're like, you know what, I'm just gonna go to Geoff because he's gonna really help me understand this and unpack this. So
I love that. And this is why your question is so fundamental as well, Andee. It's like, have you done this recently? Like, then you're able to start to uncover a lot of these. So let's get tactical and talk about some do's and some don'ts of like how we can do this. So let's talk about building this shared document. We're actually, we mentioned we're going to share a template with you guys, and we're actually going to give you an even easier version to think about. But regardless of how you do it and how you start to build it out together, the most important thing that I think you can identify with your buyer is a compelling event that they care about. If you think back to the story that I shared, the one missing piece around like my perfect loss, if you will, was I didn't have a compelling event. And it's not that I didn't ask them for it. They just didn't have something in particular that was going to drive this forward other than their yearly budget process. And that, honestly, looking back on it, is probably the biggest red flag that I had. And I kind of knew it, but I thought, I could have gotten around it, and I didn't. And so, when we think about what's our compelling event, a lot of times it's quarter end, it's discounts, it's things like that. We're going to talk about avoiding that. But, what we do want to do is figure out when they need something to change and start to work back from there. And the more detail that we can add in that's reasonable, that makes sense, that the better picture we can start to paint for our buyers. Because a lot of times they just think, oh, this is a couple months out, great, no big deal, I can make the decision in 2-3 weeks. And what they don't realize is you need to mobilize, an implementation team, a change management piece, a There can be lots of things like that. And we need to be able to help them identify who those stakeholders are and what decisions need to be made.
Yeah, we had someone in the chat talk about shared documents from an IT perspective. And yeah, obviously, you need to be careful of that. I mean, sometimes you just use like a Google Doc or something like that. But yeah, I mean, obviously check internally with your IT, or use a Teams or SharePoint typically.
We're gonna even share, something as simple as sharing an Excel back and forth by email, or even easier in email. So we're actually gonna give you guys a couple ideas for how to do this. The point is, what we're trying to do more than anything is illuminate to our buyers what needs to happen from today to make sure that they get what they want when they want it. So let's talk about some of the things we want to avoid. I mentioned it before, like quarter end or date specific discounts more often than not are something that, you know, matters to us. We don't want to underestimate just because our buyer says to us, no, don't worry, you know, that's easy, that's a fast process. It's our job to caution them and talk to them about, hey, you know, you guys may have that fast process and I'll be super excited, but based on my experience when this has happened before, oftentimes this takes, you know, 4 to 8 weeks, and I'll tell you why. Being able to do that will at least have it so your buyer is encouraged to go out and verify their likely misconception that this is an easy and fast process. And to give you guys an idea, you know, there's a difference between, hey, I am going to either reserve resources or do something so that you get what you want when you want, to, hey, you know, I'll give you this discount if you sign by 12/31. Huge difference there. And don't leave it to your buyers to figure out who needs to be involved. You need to be saying, like, in my experience, usually you have to have, you know, procurement, legal, IT, this, that, and the other thing. You guys know from your past, you know, half dozen contracts that you signed, who needs to be involved. If you don't see one of those folks, you should be asking proactively, you know, why, or if they're an exception to that rule. So Andee, anything you want to share?
Yeah, I would just say on the as far as like identifying the buyers and who needs to be involved from their side, you know, going back to sort of the challenger methodology of teach, tailor, and take control. That's where that tailoring is really important. So tailoring, you know, what a CFO wants to see, and people ask me this all the time and at Challenger, like, what do I need to tell a CEO, right? If I'm selling to a CEO, it's going to be high level numbers, right? If it's you know, the business user, that's a little bit different. That might be more feature benefits, how this is going to help you. So really thinking about like tailoring that message to who you're actually speaking to. If you're speaking to procurement or a CFO, they want to know about the numbers. They probably already want to see a little bit of some skin in the game. So maybe a short, small discount, you know, but the idea is that like, you really want to think about like with each different stakeholder, what is the most important thing to that stakeholder?
Absolutely.
So
let's give them an example. So this is, you know, for bigger, more complex, longer sales cycles, longer procurement cycles, you know, sometimes I've seen, you know, quarter-long procurement cycles that folks have told me, you might want to build out a project plan like this. Like, again, this is Excel. We're going to give you guys a version that's actually even simpler than this. I would never suggest taking on a new software like Microsoft Project, my former consulting days. That's a nightmare to learn. But we're going to share a template with you. And here's what's really important. And you guys can take it and use it as you like. Like, what are the important activities that need to happen? When do they need to happen? What's the sequence that they need to happen in? And what decisions need to be made along the way? You can see at the bottom there, we have a decision tracker. What's great about that is, you know, if you can put the decisions to be made and you can agree with it with your buyer, they can go off and start to pull off and figure out what those decisions are. Now, you may feel like this is overkill, and that's okay, because I'll tell you what is almost just as effective as the next example we're going to share with you guys, which is frankly a bulleted email. You know, like what you can see here is a bulleted email. It starts with, hey, contracting needs to happen. You know, this was a September deal because, you know, we need to run an internal thing. We need to do this. We need to do that, all so that we can get to, you know, whatever it is that they were really caring about. In this case, I think it was, you know, say a messaging workshop starting in October. And what's fair about this and what's great about it is if you can lay this out to folks and they start to slip, you can say like, look, I understand that you're slipping. I just need to let you know that we'll need to adjust our timeline to match that. And if you've worked back from a compelling event, all of a sudden they have skin in the game. They have a reason to care. Andee, I'm curious, you've done quite a bit of buying. Has anybody ever come to you with a timeline, anything like that to help lay it out? Like,
I mean, some have, but I'm always shocked. You know, so Adam Motter, SVP of sales, and I always chat about this. Like when people try to sell to us, like, you know, being from Challenger, right? You're like, why are you doing this? Why are you talking too much? Why are you showing me feature and benefits? Why are you not showing me a mutual action plan? Right? So it is funny because I do think we can be very discerning, but I'm always amazed that people don't always put this together. So I'm always shocked. And the other thing I would say, just because it is so important to me, is that the tailoring the message piece, because I do think it's really important to understand what a CEO cares about versus what a business unit, a procurement, a CFO cares about. So just really being clear on that. So we've talked a lot. Okay, sorry, go on, Geoff.
No, I was just saying that's a great point to think about it, from who cares about which part of the project. So I like.
So, so we've talked a lot about mutual, like how to actually the nuts and bolts of a mutual action plan. But I think what's also important is when and how do you introduce it? Because I think sometimes people are really scared to introduce this. I think sales reps, what you were just saying, people don't often use them, and I think it's because they feel like they're being too aggressive, or taking control too much of the process, or making assumptions. And so I always try to say, like, this is for both of us. This is something that will help both of us get to a mutual getting to the kickoff, to your point, Geoff, around, this is really what we want to get done. So, there's two and there's lots of different ways to, skin the cat. There's lots of different ways to think about your mutual action plan, but these are two ways, just if it's a renewal versus if it's a new logo. So we do try to think about those a little bit differently. So I'm going to jump to the next slide. So if it's a renewal, one of the things that I pushed really hard, I've been a Challenger 3 years, so not as long as Geoff, but I've been here 3 years. And one of the things that I really pushed hard at Challenger when I came in was this idea of a QBR, quarterly business review. And I think that's a really good time to start thinking about that renewal, and really thinking about, okay, your renewal, I mean, we all know the date of that renewal. So it makes it really easy. You've got the date. Now you got to start working backwards and say, okay, what are all the things that have to happen for us to hit that renewal date? So really understanding contract expiration dates, really being sure what those dates are, and then what does the closing plan look like? Because what you want to create is some urgency around this lapsing, right? At Challenger, we always talk about, what happens if you lose the training, and your team, you've got a bunch of new hires starting in January, they're ready for their SKO, and then you don't have your training. So making sure that there's really like that closing plan, so there is no lapse. And then, what's a go forward plan? So that's where I think, QBRs are really good, because you have the ability to kind of know those timelines, talk also about what's like new and exciting in the product. So really get them excited about what that renewal might look like. And talk about like all the exciting things that are coming up that year, but then also have a chance to really get some feedback from them, is to like, what's most meaningful for them, and what's most important to them, and what's really resonating from them, from your product or your service. So then that all can tie into that mutual action plan.
I love
Geoff,
those.
any other thoughts on renewals?
And what can be like, let's think about one of the key things that we saw was leadership turnover as what's happening right now. And you've got new leadership coming in. They didn't purchase this initially from you. They don't necessarily understand, what value it's been delivering. And they certainly don't understand what they have today that will be gone tomorrow. And we know from prospect theory that loss aversion is a very, very powerful motivator. So what I love about, this QBR approach is we need to be able to show the value we've delivered so far, but we also need to talk to them about, hey, it's okay if you guys choose not to renew. It's not what we would like, but just so you're aware, these are the potential consequences, and this is what you will no longer have, so that they at least understand that, because a lot of times leaders are at a very high level and they don't even realize, because you become part of their operation, what they're going to potentially lose. And so the other thing, and so that's like the leveraging, I think, the cost of inaction in an existing client account. And then just the one thing I'll share is that we've seen so much success. Like our product team has been rolling out some incredibly awesome stuff. Spoiler alert, we've got some apps and plugins that are coming that people really, really like. Our existing account team have been using that to drive early renewals, because frankly, folks are excited about that. So it doesn't always have to be the negative consequences. I just think you need to lay out both sides of the case so that folks are fully aware and can make a decision with plenty of time.
Yeah, and I'll just add, because Rick put this in the chat, and Rick, that's such a good point. Like, oftentimes the prospects, especially if it's a renewal, they're not even thinking about like that process. They're not like, because they're not buying something new. They're like, oh yeah, the renewal. And keep in mind, based on all the obstacles that we talked about earlier, they now have to sometimes create a business case for that renewal, or resell that renewal, which is something I think that is new. Like Geoff talked about, like that the person that initially bought it, or the leadership change that's taken place, or they've cut some of the sales team. So they all of a sudden, these people who are used to being able to just, renew are like, wait, I have to create a business case. I have to go meet with stakeholders. So it brings it up a little bit earlier in the process. So I think, Rick, that's a really great point. Thanks for sharing.
Love that.
And then new logo. So, I mean, new logo is, probably more what Geoff had shared earlier, essentially like making sure that you really understand when do they want to roll this out, and then kind of working back from those dates, making sure that you're really getting good input on the discovery call. So, like how much of a burning platform is this, how important it is for them to actually get this done by that date. And often, like, when we are creating these plans, we haven't gotten a yes from the entire buying process or the entire buying group. So we're still trying to identify those people in the organization that are actually the buying group. And so I think that's where, if you looked at Geoff's activity tracker and just understanding, like, who else do I need to connect into this, really making sure you're asking the questions around, like, who else is involved in this process? How do you buy in your organization? What do I need to know? What do I need to learn? And then things like the budget, right? If it's a new logo, they typically have never bought this before unless you're doing a competitive replacement. So, asking, like, where does this budget sit, or where do you put this line item in? What does that approval process look like? When you bought similar types of technologies or services, how has that worked out in your organization? Like, who have you gone to that for that? Is there a certain dollar amount that you have to go to a certain person for approval? So asking a lot of those questions, I think, in that new logo piece is really helpful.
Yeah, those are great points, Andee. And, a lot of times what I'll even say for folks to try to maybe, reduce some of their anxiety is, hey, a lot of times, budget isn't allocated for this. In fact, if you're trying to work within an allocated budget, it's unlikely that's going to match what you would like in terms of a solution. And that's fair, but let's talk about the process for going out. And it can also address the same type of budget freezes. Like, again, if we can figure out where we lie within the, priority of initiatives, and if we can influence ourselves moving up there, budgets can be shifted around quite easily. But we can't have that conversation until we start to introduce some of these questions and start to figure out, to your point, who's going to need to be involved to get this sign off. Going back to the painful loss, where what we learned was what used to be a decision at the business unit, the president of the business unit level, that particular year, because of being cautious around last year was very, we had the high inflationary environment, folks started to really pull back. Well, that went up to global CFO. And so all of a sudden, what used to be you're at the top of a business unit priority, you're now no longer there. You need to get into the global priorities, and things shift. But again, the one saving grace I'll share about that is we were able to highlight the risk so that when it came time for forecast accuracy, we knew that deal was at risk. Whereas maybe in a couple of years before, that would have caught me completely off guard. And I would have been like, oh yeah, we're going to close that, no problem, Q4, blah, blah, blah. And that at least gave our leadership a chance to take into account as they were rolling up their forecast.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So I know we're almost up on time, and we really want to make sure we get to hear your questions. So thank you all. Hopefully this was helpful or got you just energized to make it through Q4. But we definitely want to open it up to questions.
Yeah, and while we're waiting, I will just say, like, we're going to send out that resource for you guys. Again, use it as you like. And I hope that, even just the example of a bulleted email can be incredibly powerful, because your stakeholders can take that and start to turn it around. And, as examples of this take place, I'd love to hear from you guys, to hear your stories. Feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn, send us DMs, tag us in posts. Like, we're curious as to how you guys go out and put this into play, because we're always learning as well.
Yeah, and while we're waiting just for a few more questions to jump in on, if we go to the next slide, just so we have some some podcasts coming up. So we are this month, we are focused on strong close. So everything, all of our podcasts are connected to that. So every week we'll have a different podcast with a different guest talking about how they're using things like mutual action plans. We had someone on today, which will be released in the next week or two, and he was talking about mindset and emotional intelligence, and just how so much of this, right, is your mindset, and just really trying to keep yourself motivated. And even things like self-care are so important during Q4, because you just need to be like in the most, almost like an athlete, right? You need to be like at your optimal performance. So a lot of things, even we talked about earlier in the poll around not having, for example, lots of clutter, right? Lots of meetings. I know at Challenger, we talked a lot about, like, how do we get the sales team away from as many internal meetings as possible so they can really focus on their deals. So I am seeing some questions come in here.
I love that. I'm excited to see our future guests because I've heard some rumors and there's some big names in there. I think a great question just came in, and it's like, what's your best tip to get a deal unstuck? And I'll just share my perspective, Andee, and I'll let you share yours after. Is the one thing I want to avoid is more than one just checking an email. Like, it's perfectly fine if you've agreed to a date to check in after that. But if you're starting to get ghosted on that, what I would suggest is quickly start to go out and Google the company, look for news, look for what's going on, so that you can, at your best, look at LinkedIn posts, share an empathetic email with your buyer that you're at least keeping up with their company. And so that might look like, hey, I noticed you guys had, this press release or this announcement, or I saw this news article that mentioned that you changed this strategy, or you adjusted this, or you had this recent merger and acquisition. Is that impacting your timeline at all? If not, no worries. Just want to make sure that I'm keeping up with where you're at. That is so much more, in my opinion, thinking about the customer and being able to work with them around what could be getting in the way. And they might come back to you, and just like our hypothesis when it comes to, commercial insight, say like, yes or no, actually it's this other thing. But at least we led with something rather than putting it all on our buyer to tell us the quote unquote bad news or the challenge they're facing.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. This is a great question. Any thoughts on when your fiscal, and thank you, Susanna, for this. Any thoughts on when your fiscal year doesn't align to your customer's fiscal year outside of an important event to work toward, which may be too far out to influence a decision? So yeah, we see that a lot, right? Like, especially if you're selling into some finance organizations or nonprofits, often their year end is September. So it doesn't align with your Q4 close. So my perspective on that is, try to think of other compelling events that might help them. But also remember, back to Geoff's point, it's really about your customer's buying process, and you don't want to artificially create like a, make it so that it's so hard for them. You don't want to stress them out artificially. I do think you need to like really look at their buying journey and figure out when it makes most sense for them to buy the product or service. Because what you don't want to happen is it winds up an indecision because you pushed it at the wrong time, and then there wasn't like a burning platform. But Geoff, I'd love your advice on that.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Andee. The one thing I would add to it is, what is the cost of inaction for them on waiting on their fiscal year? Because that's going to determine where you're at in their priority list. It's like, if you guys wait, 6 months, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months to implement this, what about their current status quo today is costing them that they could go out and share with their different, folks, their leadership, that could get them to go, actually, you know what? This is a problem we're solving out of budget cycle. This is a problem that maybe we need to shift some money around and start to solve. And if we can have an honest conversation around that and get that to socialize out in our buyers organization, we'll at least be able to more accurately forecast it. Because if we can't get it and they say no, okay, then I would suggest that deal is fairly at risk. If we can start to have that conversation, then all of a sudden the budget will appear outside of the fiscal cycle.
Yeah, and I would just add, as a CEO, like, please don't discount that to get them to buy, because it does erode your profit margins, right? Like, you're better off, and these are conversations obviously you need to have with your leadership team, and but don't just discount to get it done. You're better off sometimes waiting another quarter. One, it's gonna be better for your commission, but two, it's really better for the organization if you don't try to discount your way to get them to buy something at the wrong time, right? As we know, going back to the BANT world of, we all, back in the day when I learned how to sell, budget, autonomy, right? But, need, and then the T is timing, right? Timing is really critical, and when you're selling. So yeah, let's see, next question. What are some of the best questions to ask to understand your customer's buying process? I'll let you start with that, Geoff. You're good at that.
Yeah. First off, I think your question's the best one, Andee, is like, have you done it recently? And what was that like? And if they say no, then I think it's excellent to say, you know what, let's talk a little bit. Oftentimes we see these folks involved. Do you know who those are for you? And if they say no, that might be the very first thing that I task them with. Remember, challengers ask oftentimes powerful questions, but they also make powerful requests. And so asking your buyer to go out in between a meeting and learn something about their internal organization, their internal process, is totally reasonable. And it will pressure test just how serious they are. And so that might be where I would start, is like, hey, we normally see procurement, legal, IT involved. Like, curious if you're familiar with those folks, and if not, can we figure out who they are? I'm happy to take some of that off of your plate, but I need to know who I need to be reaching out to and have you make an introduction first.
So I think we have time for one last question. I think this is a good one and a great way to end it. How do you avoid the Q4 crunch, and like what could you do ahead of time to make sure that maybe some of your deals, either you pull them forward or they don't close, if they don't close in Q4, what do you do in Q1 to avoid some of that stress? So any thoughts on that, Geoff?
Yeah, I mean, like, frankly, I think, and maybe I'm a little bit unique in this sense, but like, we can't force buyers to buy when the timing isn't right. And so the one thing that I really try to be cautious about is not trying to create a false sense of urgency around year-end close. If I, frankly, I don't have like the cost of inaction of the different cases. And so I think what's very reasonable is, if it looks like you're not going to get it into Q4, is to start putting some real milestones around, things in Q1, and even offer to do some things, maybe pro bono in between. For example, I had folks earlier in the year tell me like, hey, it's just not the right time. And I said, okay, great. When do you think the right time would be? Oh, a quarter out. Well, for that to happen, these other things likely, you're going to want to get momentum. You're going to want to get this. I'm happy to run this session for you. Would you be, willing to do that? And what you find is the law of reciprocity. Folks do not want to take you up on that if they're not serious. And you can learn very quickly just how serious they are, or whether they're just trying to placate you by pushing you off. And that'll at least give you the vision. Because again, we can't force people to buy. We can just help them make a decision.
Yeah. And the only other thing I'll say is just, and I know it's hard in Q4 because people are so focused on closing Q4, but also think about Q1, right? I do think, if you feel like something is just not going to work out for Q4, start really planning for it in Q1, but also start planning for your Q1, because the last thing you want to do is come off of like a burnt out Q4 and then realize that you don't have your pipeline set for Q1. So as much as like, I know we're asking a lot of our sales people, during Q4 and even for us during Q1, but I really think it's like, start really thinking about that pipeline. And I know like outbound calling and prospecting is not exactly what you want to be doing in Q4, but like I said, just always thinking a quarter ahead, I think reduces like some of that stress, especially during, sort of some of the downtime as you're waiting for people to get back to you from your mutual action plan. So, well, thank you all. We are out of time. I hope this was helpful. If we just go to the next slide, it does have all of our podcasts. So feel free to join. These are great ways in between our webinars to learn more about account close. We also have our Leading the Challenger Sale webinar on December 14th, which will be joined by Ian and Nader, part of our advisory board. They're going to do an awesome year in the review, so definitely don't miss that. Thanks, everyone, and have a great Q4. Good luck and stay strong.
Good luck, everybody.